Some say the deadliest gun in the West belongs to the fastest draw. Others claim it's the man willing to fire first and ask questions later. But those who've lived long enough to tell the tale know the truth. The most dangerous weapon is the one that never misses. In the Arizona Territory of 1885, a widow was about to remind every soul in Copper Ridge of that ancient wisdom. The bullet struck Luther Kane square in the chest button of his coat. Not an inch higher, not a fraction lower. The impact spun him backward, his Remington revolver clattering onto the sun-baked earth as he fell to his knees, hands clutching at fabric that should have been soaked with blood. But there was no blood, only the shattered remains of a brass button and the cold realization that whoever fired that shot could have killed him just as easily. 72 hours earlier, the morning sun crept over Shadow Pine Mesa like molten copper spilling across the Arizona sky. Sarah Whitehorse stood alone in the yard of her ranch, a Winchester rifle cradled in her arms, with the easy familiarity of a woman who'd held such weapons longer than most men had been alive. At 45, she carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that comes not from wealth or station, but from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to apologize for it. Her dark hair, streaked with silver like veins of ore through stone, was pulled back in a simple braid. Her hands, weathered by sun and work, moved with the precision of a watchmaker as she loaded 6 cartridges into the rifle's magazine. 300 yards downrange, 6 tin cans sat balanced on fence posts. Each one bore a small white button sewn onto its face with thread. To most shooters, hitting the cans themselves would be impressive. Sarah Whitehorse wasn't aiming for the cans. 18-year-old Ethan Whitehorse emerged from the barn carrying his own rifle, a gift from his late father that he'd only recently grown tall enough to handle properly. He watched his mother settle into her stance with the kind of reverence some men reserve for watching artists paint or musicians perform, because what Sarah did with a rifle was nothing short of art. "Pa taught me to aim center mass," Ethan said, his voice still carrying the uncertain timbre of a boy becoming a man. "Why do you always aim for the strangest places?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she drew in a slow breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's crack echoed across the valley like a thunderclap. 300 yards away, the first button exploded into fragments, the can beneath it spinning wildly but remaining upright on its post. "Because sometimes," Sarah said quietly, working the lever action and chambering a second round, "the purpose isn't to kill. It's to send a message." 5 more shots followed in quick succession. 5 more buttons disintegrated. 5 more cans spun like dancers but stayed balanced on their perches. When the echo of the final shot faded, Sarah lowered the rifle and turned to her son. "Anyone can kill Ethan. It takes no particular skill to destroy, but to hit exactly what you mean to hit, nothing more and nothing less, that takes discipline, control, and most importantly, it takes knowing when to pull the trigger and when to keep your fingers still." Ethan studied the distant targets, trying to comprehend the level of precision required to thread a bullet through objects no larger than a silver dollar at that distance. His father had been considered an exceptional shot during his years as a U.S. Marshal. But what his mother possessed was something else entirely, something that bordered on the supernatural. "Show me it wasn't luck," he said, the challenge gentle but genuine. Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face from stern to almost playful. She pointed to a cottonwood tree another 100 yards beyond the fence posts. A single leaf, beginning to turn gold with the changing season, clung to a branch that swayed gently in the morning breeze. "Watch," she said simply. The rifle came up again. Sarah's breathing slowed, her body becoming absolutely still despite the fact she was standing unsupported. The world seemed to hold its breath with her. Then the rifle spoke once more, and 400 yards away, that single leaf separated from its branch and spiraled to the ground. Ethan's eyes widened. Even at this distance, he could see the clean hole punched through the leaf's center, the edges singed black from the passage of the bullet. "How?" he breathed. "Your father taught you how to shoot," Sarah replied, ejecting the spent cartridge and catching it before it hit the ground. "I'm teaching you how to choose what to shoot. There's a considerable difference." The ride into Copper Ridge took them through terrain that shifted from high desert scrub to stands of ponderosa pine as they descended from the mesa. Sarah drove their wagon with practiced ease, the team of horses responding to the slightest pressure on the reins. Ethan sat beside her, his rifle within easy reach, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape with the wariness his father had drilled into him before death claimed the elder white horse 5 years prior. The town of Copper Ridge had grown considerably since Sarah first arrived as a young bride 23 years ago. What had been a collection of rough shanties and tents had transformed into a proper frontier settlement, complete with a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a church with an actual bell tower, and enough saloons to suggest the citizens valued their liquor more than their salvation. The population sign at the town limits read 1,200 souls, though Sarah suspected the actual number was higher if you counted all the prospectors, drifters, and men running from past mistakes who called the surrounding hills home. Patrick Sullivan's general store occupied a prime corner location, its broad windows displaying everything from mining equipment to ladies' bonnets. Sullivan himself, a broad-shouldered Irishman of 58 with a magnificent white beard, was arranging canned goods on a shelf when Sarah and Ethan entered. His weathered face broke into a genuine smile at the sight of them, though Sarah noticed the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mrs. Whitehorse, young Ethan," Sullivan greeted, wiping his hands on his apron. "Fine morning for a supply run." "That it is, Patrick," Sarah replied, producing a carefully written list from her coat pocket. "Though I suspect you have news that might sour it." Sullivan's smile faded entirely. He glanced toward the store's back room, then lowered his voice. "There was a man in here yesterday. Eastern gentleman, expensive suit, gold watch chain thick as my thumb. He was asking questions about your late husband. Had a ledger book with Thomas's name circled in red ink." And Sarah's expression didn't change, but Ethan noticed the subtle shift in her posture, the way her weight redistributed almost imperceptibly onto the balls of her feet. It was the stance of someone preparing to move, to fight, to run. The stance of a predator, not prey. "Did this gentleman have a name?" Sarah asked. "Silas Crane. Said he represented interests back east. Railroad interests." Sullivan produced a folded piece of paper from beneath his counter. "He left this. Town meeting tonight, mandatory attendance for all property holders. I expect they'll be discussing their plans." Sarah unfolded the notice. The printing was professional, the language formal and vaguely threatening in the way legal documents often are. But the core message was clear. Change was coming to Copper Ridge, and those who stood in its way would be moved one way or another. "Thank you for the warning, Patrick," Sarah said, tucking the notice into her pocket. "We'll attend." As they loaded supplies into their wagon, Ethan kept his voice low. "You think this is about our land?" "I know it is," Sarah replied. "Your father always said the day would come when someone decided our little piece of heaven was worth more to them than to us. He prepared for that day. Now we'll see if his preparations were sufficient." The town hall that evening was packed to capacity. Every chair was filled, every wall lined with standing citizens. The air was thick with tobacco smoke sweat and the particular tension that comes when people sense their lives are about to be altered without their consent. Sarah and Ethan claimed a spot near the back, close to the exit, where they could observe without being trapped. Mayor Franklin Walsh, a portly man of 55, whose fondness for expensive cigars was matched only by his fondness for bribes, called the meeting to order with considerably more enthusiasm than his usual council sessions warranted. Beside him stood a man who could only be Silas Crane. Crane was everything Sullivan had described and more. Perhaps 52 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of money, influence, and the subtle threat of both. His suit probably cost more than most families in Copper Ridge earned in a year. His eyes, however, told a different story. They were the eyes of a man haunted by something driven by demons that wealth couldn't exorcise. "Gentlemen, ladies," Crane began, his voice carrying the cultured accent of Boston or Philadelphia, "I come before you tonight not as a stranger, but as a messenger of progress. The Southern Pacific Railroad stands ready to bring prosperity to your community, to connect you with markets and opportunities that currently exist only in your dreams." He gestured to a large map hanging behind him, colorful illustrations showing gleaming trains, bustling stations, and thriving businesses. The railroad line ran straight through the heart of the territory, a black line that bisected properties and lives with geometric indifference. Within 18 months, Copper Ridge will transform from a remote outpost into a vital hub of commerce. Property values will triple. Employment opportunities will multiply. Your children will inherit a future limited only by their ambitions, not by their geography. The crowd murmured approval. These were people who'd known hardship, isolation, the brutal reality of frontier existence. The promise of connection, of wealth, of progress was intoxicating. Then Crane's tone shifted, became almost regretful. "However, progress requires sacrifice. There are certain parcels of land along our proposed route that currently sit in private hands. Hands that, despite our generous offers, seem reluctant to release their grip for the greater good." His eyes found Sarah across the crowded room. The gesture was subtle, but enough people followed his gaze that soon half the hall was staring at the widow in the back corner. "Mrs. Whitehorse," Crane said, his voice carrying false sympathy, "your unique heritage makes you sentimental about ancestral land, I understand, but sentiment doesn't feed children or build communities. Your late husband's property sits directly in the path of progress. We've made fair offers, more than fair. And yet you persist in this stubborn refusal that benefits no one and harms many." Sarah remained perfectly still, her face composed. But Ethan felt the heat rising in his own chest, the anger building at this stranger's presumption. "My ancestors," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the murmuring crowd with unexpected authority, "walked this land for 1,000 years before the first railroad spike was ever forged. Your gleaming progress has existed for 50 years, Mr. Crane. Who precisely understands permanence better?" The crowd fell silent. Some faces showed agreement, others anger. Crane's expression remained pleasant, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Permanence," he replied, "is an illusion, Mrs. Whitehorse. Everything changes. Everything must change. Those who fail to adapt are swept aside by history's tide. I would hate to see you swept aside." It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but everyone in that room understood the message beneath the words. Sarah Whitehorse could sell voluntarily, or she could be removed involuntarily. The outcome was predetermined. Only the method remained to be determined. Sarah turned and walked toward the exit, Ethan close behind. As they reached the door, she paused and looked back at Crane. "No," she said simply. The single word hung in the air like smoke. Then they were gone, leaving a room full of people to contemplate what came next when an unstoppable force met an immovable object. The parking area behind the town hall was lit by oil lamps hung from posts, casting dancing shadows that turned horses and wagons into strange, distorted shapes. Sarah and Ethan had almost reached their wagon when 3 figures emerged from those shadows, arranged in a loose semicircle that suggested practice in blocking exits. Silas Crane stood in the center, flanked by 2 men whose occupations were written plainly in the way they carried themselves. The man on Crane's left was Luther Kane, late 30s or early 40s, with a scar running from temple to jaw like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. His coat hung open despite the evening chill, providing easy access to the Remington revolver holstered at his hip. The other was Miguel Torres, younger by a decade, with quick eyes and quicker hands, the kind of man who'd learned early that violence solved problems other methods couldn't. "Mrs. Whitehorse," Crane said, his cultured voice at odds with the implied threat of the situation, "I was hoping we might speak privately, away from the emotions of the crowd." "We have nothing to discuss privately that couldn't be said publicly," Sarah replied. Her hand moved almost casually to rest on Ethan's arm, a subtle signal for him to remain calm, to watch and learn. "I understand your position," Crane continued, stepping closer. "Truly I do. That land represents your late husband's legacy, but perhaps you don't fully understand mine." He paused, and for just a moment the mask of the confident businessman slipped, revealing something raw and wounded beneath. "I had a son, Mrs. Whitehorse. Thomas was his name, same as your late husband. 12 years old in 1881 when a railroad bridge collapsed during construction in Kansas. Shoddy materials rushed work, corporate greed choosing profit over safety. I held my boy as he died, his last words asking if we'd built it wrong." The pain in Crane's voice was genuine, undeniable. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but her stance didn't change. "Every father's grief matters, Mr. Crane. Every loss leaves scars. But using your tragedy to justify taking from others doesn't honor your son's memory. It dishonors it." Crane's jaw tightened. "I've spent 4 years ensuring what happened to Thomas never happens to another child. Your land provides the only geologically stable route through this region. Every other option requires bridges over canyons, tunnels through unstable rock. More chances for accidents, for death. Your stubbornness isn't just inconvenient, Mrs. Whitehorse, it's potentially murderous. And this," Sarah gestured at Kane and Torres, "is how you prevent murder by surrounding a widow and her son in a dark parking lot. This is how I demonstrate seriousness of purpose," Crane replied. Kane shifted his weight slightly, hand drifting closer to his revolver. Torres remained utterly still, a coiled spring waiting for release. Then Ethan stepped forward, young and foolish and brave, in the way only 18-year-old boys can be. "My mother said no, Mr. Crane. That's the end of it." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Crane smiled, though the expression held no warmth. "You must be Ethan. I've heard about you. Your father was Thomas Whitehorse, U.S. Marshal, decorated veteran respected throughout the territory. They say he understood progress, understood the needs of civilization versus the wants of individuals." "You didn't know my father," Ethan said coldly. "Perhaps not personally, but I know men like him, good men who sometimes had to make hard choices for the greater good. Your mother here, she's letting sentiment cloud judgment. That ranch is too much for a woman alone, too isolated, too vulnerable." Crane pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. $8,000, Mrs. Whitehorse. Enough to purchase a comfortable home in town, to ensure young Ethan here receives proper education, to live without the constant struggle of maintaining property that's clearly beyond your capabilities. "Our life isn't for sale," Sarah replied quietly. "Everything," Crane said, "is for sale. It's simply a matter of finding the right price, or the right pressure." He gestured to Kane, who produced his own document, legal papers dense with official language. "The territorial governor is currently reviewing certain property boundaries established before Arizona became a territory. There appear to be discrepancies in your land grant, Mrs. Whitehorse. Questions about whether your husband's claim was properly filed, given certain treaty obligations regarding native lands." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "The Whitehorse grant was registered in 1862 under the Homestead Act. It predates any conflicting treaties." "Are you certain?" Crane asked. "Because my lawyers have found some very interesting irregularities. It would be unfortunate if legal complications forced a sale at a much reduced value, or worse, if those outlaws everyone's been worried about decided your remote ranch made an appealing target." The threat was barely veiled now. Kane's hand rested openly on his revolver. Torres had shifted position to block their most direct route to the wagon. But Sarah Whitehorse didn't flinch. Instead, she looked directly into Silas Crane's eyes with an intensity that made the businessman take an involuntary step backward. "Yes, Mr. Crane," she said softly. "Things do get very dangerous in these mountains. Accidents happen, particularly to men who mistake isolation for vulnerability." The two locked gazes, neither willing to concede. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "Sarah Whitehorse, I'd recognize that stubborn set to your jaw anywhere." They all turned. An elderly man approached from the direction of the street, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had absorbed more than its share of hard miles. He was perhaps 65, tall and lean, with close-cropped gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His clothes were simple but well-maintained, and he carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. Colonel Vernon Blackwood had arrived in Copper Ridge. "Vernon?" Sarah breathed genuine surprise, breaking through her composed facade. "Apologies for the interruption, gentlemen," Vernon said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of decades spent leading soldiers. "But I believe this conversation has reached its natural conclusion. Mrs. Whitehorse and her son will be leaving now. I trust there are no objections." It wasn't really a question. Kane and Torres looked to Crane, who after a moment's calculation stepped aside. "No objections, Colonel, for now, but Mrs. Whitehorse has 48 hours to reconsider our generous offer. After that, I'll be forced to pursue other avenues. Good evening." Crane and his men melted back into the shadows, leaving Sarah, Ethan, and Vernon standing in the lamplight. "Colonel Vernon Blackwood," Sarah said, shaking her head in wonder. "I thought you were retired in Santa Fe." "I was," Vernon replied with a slight smile, "until I received a very interesting telegram last week from an old friend. Thomas made me promise years ago that if anything ever happened to him, I'd watch over you and the boy. I take my promises seriously, Sarah. Always have." Ethan stared at this stranger who spoke of his father with such easy familiarity. "You knew Pa." "Knew him?" Vernon's smile widened. "Son, I taught your father everything he knew about strategy, tactics, and staying alive when the odds said you should be dead. Which, given present circumstances, seems like knowledge you're about to need." As they rode back toward the ranch, Vernon, in the wagon bed with the supplies, the old soldier's eyes constantly scanning the darkness for followers. He spoke quietly but with absolute conviction. "They'll come for you, Sarah. Men like Crane don't make threats they're not prepared to execute. You need to prepare this land to defend itself." "I know," Sarah replied. "Thomas and I planned for this possibility. The question is whether our preparations will be sufficient." Vernon reached into his coat and produced a rolled piece of canvas. Even in the dim moonlight, Sarah recognized it as a map hand-drawn with a kind of detail that spoke of years of careful observation. "Your husband and I spent 3 years working on this, Sarah. Every cave, every ravine, every hidden spring within 20 miles of your property. We turned Shadow Pine Mesa into a fortress. The only question is whether you remember how to use it." Sarah's hands tightened on the reins. Beside her, Ethan leaned forward, trying to make out details on the map in the darkness. "I remember," Sarah said quietly. "And I'm about to remind Mr. Silas Crane why 3 generations of Whitehorse family have held this land against all comers. Not because of gold or water or strategic value, but because we know every inch of it better than we know our own souls. And sometimes, Colonel, that knowledge is the deadliest weapon of all." Vernon nodded slowly, rolling the map back up. "Then tomorrow we begin, because in 48 hours Crane will send his wolves, and we need to be ready to show them that the shepherd's staff can strike just as hard as any fang." The wagon rolled on through the darkness, carrying 3 souls toward a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of one ranch, but the very definition of justice in a land where the law was still learning to walk upright. Dawn arrived at Shadow Pine Mesa with the reluctance of something that knew violence was coming. Colonel Vernon Blackwood stood in the main room of the White Horse Ranch House, spreading his hand-drawn map across the heavy oak table that had witnessed 3 generations of family decisions. Sarah and Ethan gathered close, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of oil lamps that pushed back against the pre-dawn darkness. "Your father understood something most men never learn," Vernon said, his weathered finger tracing lines across the canvas. "Superior numbers mean nothing if you control the terrain. Thomas and I spent 3 years turning this property into something more than a ranch. We built a fortress that doesn't look like one." The map revealed details that even Sarah had forgotten in the 5 years since Thomas's death. Hidden cave systems that honeycombed the mesa's western face, natural choke points where narrow trails forced riders into single file, springs and water sources marked with symbols only someone trained in military cartography would recognize. And throughout it all, carefully noted positions where a skilled marksman could command fields of fire that covered hundreds of yards. "Crane will come at us with force," Vernon continued, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd seen this particular dance many times before. "Men like him always do. They'll try intimidation first, then property damage, then direct confrontation. The pattern is as predictable as sunrise." "How many men?" Ethan asked. "Kane and Torres we've already met, but my sources in town suggest Crane has hired at least 3 more. Professional guns, not local toughs. Men who know their business." Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the land she'd fought so hard to keep. The rising sun painted the distant peaks with gold and crimson, beautiful and indifferent to human struggles. 5 against 3, she said quietly. "Poor odds for a direct fight." "Which is why we won't fight direct," Vernon replied. "Sarah, you're the finest shot I've ever known, bar none. You'll be our primary deterrent positioned where you can cover the most critical approaches. Ethan, you're young and quick, perfect for drawing them where we want them. And I'll coordinate everything from a central position where I can respond to changing situations." "That's still only 3 of us against 5 of them," Ethan pointed out. Vernon smiled, the expression containing secrets. "I sent a telegram last night. If my timing is right, we'll have reinforcements by midday, someone who owes your family a debt that can never fully be repaid." Before anyone could ask who he meant, Vernon moved to the far wall and pressed his hand against what appeared to be solid timber. With a soft click, a section of paneling swung inward, revealing a space behind that none of them had known existed. Inside sat a compact iron safe, its surface decorated with scratches that suggested it had traveled far before finding this hiding place. "Thomas installed this the year before he died," Vernon explained, producing a key from inside his coat. "He said if the day ever came when you needed it, I'd know." The safe's door swung open with well-oiled silence. Inside lay bundles of cash, legal documents, and a leather portfolio tied with string. But what drew everyone's attention was the object resting on top a second map, this one drawn on vellum so old it was nearly transparent. Vernon lifted it with careful reverence and spread it beside the first map. Where his hand-drawn chart showed the surface terrain, this ancient document revealed something else entirely. A network of passages and chambers that ran beneath Shadowpine Mesa like veins beneath skin. Some were natural limestone caves formed over millennia by underground water. Others bore the marks of human construction tunnels dug by hands long turned to dust. "Your great-grandfather discovered these during the first winter," Vernon said. "Apache had used them for generations before that, hiding from Spanish conquistadors and later from American cavalry. Thomas explored every inch, reinforced the critical passage's stockpiled supplies in the deepest chambers. If we're forced to fall back, we have a fortress beneath the earth itself." Sarah stared at the map, seeing her husband's hand in the careful notations, his characteristic attention to detail in the measurements and observations. He'd prepared for this day even as he'd hoped it would never come. The thought filled her with a complex mixture of grief and gratitude. "He never stopped being a marshal, did he?" she said softly. Even after he hung up the badge, he was still protecting people. "The best ones never do," Vernon replied. "They just choose different battles to fight." The sound of approaching horses interrupted further discussion. 3 riders appeared on the eastern trail, moving at an easy pace that suggested they weren't trying to hide their arrival. Ethan's hand dropped to his pistol, but Vernon raised a calming hand. "That will be our reinforcement, right on schedule." The lead rider was a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered and weathered, with the kind of face that had seen too much and remembered all of it. A silver star gleamed on his vest, catching the morning light. Behind him rode 2 younger men, deputies by the look of their bearing and equipment. "Marshal James Everett," Vernon called from the porch. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how to find this place." Everett swung down from his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it. His eyes found Sarah, and held there for a moment, respect and old friendship evident in his expression. "Sarah Whitehorse. Been too long. I'm sorry it takes trouble to bring me back." "Trouble seems to be our family specialty," Sarah replied, descending the steps to shake his hand. "What brings a U.S. Marshal to our remote corner of the world, officially tracking what's left of the Rattlesnake Gang. 3 of them hit a stage near Prescott last month. Trail led east right through Copper Ridge." He paused, his expression hardening. "Unofficially, Vernon sent word that Silas Crane was making moves on Whitehorse land. Thomas saved my life twice during the war. I owe this family more than I can ever repay." Vernon gestured toward the house. "Then you'll want to see what we're dealing with. Crane's hired himself a small army." Over coffee and hardtack, Everett shared what his own sources had revealed. Crane had indeed recruited 5 gunmen each, with a reputation for getting results through methods that existed in the gray area between legal and criminal. Luther Kane, the scarred enforcer they'd already met. Miguel Torres Young, but deadly with a pistol. Jeremiah Morrison, a massive man whose size made him useful for intimidation. And 2 others whose names Everett spoke with particular gravity. "Cole Dalton," he said, "is probably the most dangerous, former Army scout. Then a Pinkerton man, now freelance. He's smart, experienced, and reportedly has a code of honor that's gotten flexible with age. If Crane wants someone tracked or cornered, Dalton's the man to do it." "And the 5th?" Sarah asked. "That's the interesting part. Local man goes by the name of Scorpion, though that's obviously not what his mother called him. Nobody seems to know his real identity, but he knows this territory better than anyone except maybe you. Crane's using him as a guide." Vernon leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in thought. 5 professional guns against 4 of us. Still poor odds. 3.5, Ethan corrected. "I'm not exactly a seasoned fighter." "You will be after this," Vernon said grimly. "Because tonight they'll make their first real move. Crane gave Sarah 48 hours. That deadline expires at sunset. My bet is they'll hit us hard, try to scatter the livestock, and destroy property. Make it clear that continued resistance will only get more expensive." "Then we need to be ready," Sarah said. "James, can your deputies watch the north and south approaches that leaves the main eastern trail and the hidden western passage?" "I'll take the west," Vernon said. "It's the route they're least likely to know about, but if this Scorpion is as good as advertised, he might have found it. Ethan, you'll be visible on the eastern approach doing normal ranch work. Make yourself a target." "And me?" Sarah asked. Vernon's smile was wolfish. "You, my dear, will be exactly where you do the most good. 400 yards back from wherever the action starts, with a clear line of sight, and that Winchester of yours. We're not trying to kill anyone today. We're sending a message. And nothing sends a message quite like bullets landing exactly where the shooter wants them, no matter how impossible that seems." The plan set, they dispersed to their positions. Everett's deputies took up posts with lines of sight on the main approaches. Vernon disappeared into the landscape with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime making himself invisible. Sarah climbed to a rocky outcrop on the mesa's southern face, a position that gave her overlapping fields of fire, covering 3 different approaches to the ranch. Ethan remained in the open working on fence repairs near the eastern pasture. To any observer, he was simply a young rancher maintaining his property. Only someone watching very carefully would notice how his hands never strayed far from the rifle leaning against the fence post, or how his eyes constantly scanned the tree line for movement. The sun climbed toward its zenith. Heat shimmered off the rocks, turning distant objects into wavering mirages. Somewhere, a hawk cried the sound sharp and lonely. Then, just as Vernon had predicted, they came. The crack of distant gunfire shattered the afternoon stillness. Ethan saw movement in the trees, riders emerging at a gallop, firing pistols into the air to spook the grazing cattle. The herd scattered in panic, breaking through the fence line Ethan had just repaired. He recognized Torres and Morrison among the riders, their faces masked with bandanas, but their builds unmistakable. Ethan grabbed his rifle and ran toward his horse, playing his part perfectly. The performance was convincing enough that Morrison wheeled his mount and gave chase, whooping like this was sport rather than intimidation. But Ethan wasn't running in panic. He was running toward the forest, toward terrain he knew, and they didn't leading them exactly where Vernon wanted them. 400 yards away, Sarah watched through the telescopic sight Thomas had special ordered from a gunsmith in Denver. The optics brought the scene into sharp focus, every detail clear despite the distance. She tracked Morrison's pursuit, her finger resting lightly on the trigger, waiting for the perfect moment. Then she shifted slightly, finding a different target. Luther Kane sat his horse at the edge of the tree line, observing the chaos with the professional detachment of someone supervising rather than participating. He held a rifle across his saddle head, turning as he scanned for threats. Sarah's breathing slowed. The world narrowed to the circle of the scope, to the mathematics of wind and distance, and the gentle rise and fall of her own heartbeat. She'd made this shot 100 times in practice. Now it was time to prove it wasn't just luck. The Winchester spoke its report, rolling across the valley like thunder. 400 yards away, Luther Kane's hat leaped from his head as if plucked by an invisible hand. The bullet had passed through the crown without touching hair or skin, a demonstration of control so absolute it bordered on contemptuous. Kane's horse reared, startled by the sudden motion. The gunman fought for control, his head whipping around to try and locate the source of the shot. But Sarah was already cycling another round, finding Torres in her sights. This time, she aimed lower at the canteen hanging from his saddle. The second shot punched through metal and cork, sending water spraying in an arc that caught the afternoon sunlight. Torres shouted something Sarah couldn't hear at this distance, but she read his body language easily enough. Fear, confusion, the sudden understanding that someone was shooting at them with precision that made 400 yards seem like point-blank range. Morrison abandoned his pursuit of Ethan and galloped back toward the tree line. The cattle raid dissolved into chaos as Crane's men realized they'd miscalculated badly. Within minutes, they'd retreated into the forest, leaving trampled grass and scattered livestock as evidence of their failed intimidation. Sarah remained in position, rifle ready, watching for any sign of renewed assault. But the attack was over, at least for now. She'd sent her message written in powder smoke and perfectly placed bullets. The White Horse Ranch would not be taken easily. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a lone rider approached from the forest. He came slowly, hands visible and empty, making no threatening moves. Ethan spotted him first and signaled Vernon, who materialized from cover with the silence of smoke. The rider was Cole Dalton. Up close, he was older than his reputation suggested, perhaps 38, with gray threading through dark hair and eyes that had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. He reined in 20 yards from where Ethan stood, his gaze moving from the young man to Vernon, and finally settling on the distant outcrop where he correctly guessed Sarah maintained her overwatch position. "I need to speak with Mrs. Whitehorse," Dalton called. "No tricks, no threats, just words that need saying." "Say them from there," Vernon replied, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. Dalton nodded slowly as if he'd expected nothing less. Then he looked directly at Ethan, really studied him, and something shifted in his expression. "Whitehorse," he said quietly. "Thomas Whitehorse was your father." It wasn't a question. Ethan's hand tightened on his rifle. "He was. You have a problem with that." "Problem?" Dalton's laugh was bitter. "Son, your father saved my life in Abilene in '78. I was working a Pinkerton case, got ambushed by the men I was tracking. Your father happened to be passing through, heard gunfire, and instead of riding on like any sensible man would have, he rode straight into that fight and pulled me out. Took a bullet in the shoulder doing it." The gunman's eyes glistened with something that might have been shame. "I owe Thomas Whitehorse my life, which means I owe his family. Crane lied to us, said you were squatters causing trouble. If I'd known the truth, I never would have taken this job." "And now that you do know," Vernon asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Now I'm switching sides," Dalton replied simply. "Crane's planning to escalate. He's got the territorial governor arriving tomorrow morning, supposedly to resolve the land dispute. But what's really happening is a setup. Walsh, your mayor, is in Crane's pocket. They're going to claim your property is abandoned due to outlaw activity, then force a sale through emergency powers." The implications hit like a physical blow. If the governor declared the land abandoned, Sarah would lose everything regardless of legal rights or moral standing. The law itself was being corrupted to serve Crane's purposes. When Sarah's voice carried from her position, startling Dalton, who hadn't realized she'd moved closer during the conversation. "Dawn tomorrow. Walsh is bringing the governor straight here, expecting to find burned buildings and scattered livestock. Evidence of an Indian raid or outlaw attack. Crane's paying Kane and the others to make it look convincing." "Will they kill?" Vernon asked bluntly. Dalton hesitated, then nodded. "Kane would. Morrison might if pushed. Torres, I think he's having second thoughts. This has gotten uglier than any of us anticipated." "And you?" Ethan challenged. "What's to stop you from riding back and telling Crane everything we just discussed?" The former Pinkerton man met the young man's eyes steadily. "Nothing but my word. Thomas Whitehorse trusted me with his life once. I'm asking you to do the same now. Because if we don't stop Crane tonight, before the governor arrives, you'll lose this land no matter how straight you shoot or how well you know the terrain." Vernon looked to Sarah, a question in his eyes. She studied Dalton for a long moment, weighing instinct against risk, honor against practicality. Then she lowered her rifle. "Tonight, then," she said. "We end this before dawn. But understand, Mr. Dalton, if you're playing us false, my next bullet won't be a warning shot." As darkness fell over Shadow Pine Mesa, 5 figures gathered in the White Horse Ranch house. Vernon spread maps across the table once more, but this time they were planning not defense but offense. Somewhere in the night, Silas Crane and his remaining guns were preparing their final assault. They would come with fire and violence, expecting to break a widow's spirit and claim her land. They had no idea they were riding into a trap laid by some of the most dangerous people the Arizona Territory had ever produced. And by morning, they would learn that sometimes the hunted become the hunters, and precision trumps force every single time. The plan required perfect timing and absolute trust. As false dawn painted the eastern sky with bands of pale gray coal, Dalton rode back into the forest where Crane's remaining men waited. He carried with him a story crafted by Vernon's tactical mind, a lie wrapped in enough truth to be believable. Ethan Whitehorse had been caught alone, separated from his mother and the mysterious sharpshooter who'd humiliated them yesterday. The boy was young, scared, and ready to cooperate if it meant saving his mother's life. Kane listened to Dalton's report with the skepticism of a man who'd survived this long by trusting nothing at face value. But Crane, desperate and running out of time with the governor's arrival imminent, heard what he wanted to hear. The White Horse defense was cracking. Victory was within reach. "Bring him," Crane ordered. "If the boy signs the transfer documents, we can present the governor with a clean resolution. If not, well, accidents happen in these wild mountains." Dalton rode out again as the sun broke free of the horizon, golden light spilling across the landscape like honey. He found Ethan exactly where they'd arranged, working on fence repairs near the eastern tree line. The young man looked up as Dalton approached his face, showing exactly the right mixture of defiance and fear for any watchers hidden in the forest. "Your mother has one last chance," Dalton called loud enough for his voice to carry. "Mr. Crane is willing to negotiate in person. You come with me, talk sense into her. Maybe we can end this without more trouble." "And if I refuse?" Ethan challenged. Dalton's hand moved to his pistol, the gesture theatrical and obvious. "Then we end it the hard way. Your choice, boy." Ethan raised his hand slowly, abandoning his rifle against the fence post with apparent reluctance. Dalton produced a length of rope and bound the young man's wrists tight enough to look convincing, but loose enough that Ethan could slip free when the moment came. Then they rode together into the forest toward where Crane waited with his remaining guns. The camp occupied a small clearing surrounded by ponderosa pines, their trunks standing like silent witnesses to the confrontation about to unfold. Crane sat on a fallen log, his expensive suit incongruous against the rough wilderness setting. Kane stood to his right hand, resting on his pistol. Torres paced nearby, nervous energy evident in every movement. Morrison loomed in the background, massive and quiet. "Mr. Whitehorse," Crane said as Dalton pushed Ethan into the clearing, "I'm glad you've decided to be reasonable. This unpleasantness has gone on far too long." "I haven't decided anything," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the vulnerable position. "You wanted to talk, so talk." Crane stood producing folded documents from inside his coat. "These papers transfer ownership of your mother's property to the railroad consortium I represent. Sign them, and she receives fair compensation, plus safe passage to anywhere in the territory. Refuse, and I'm forced to take measures neither of us will enjoy." "Measures?" Ethan repeated. "You mean murder." For the first time, Crane's composed facade cracked. Pain and rage flickered across his face, the mask of the civilized businessman slipping to reveal something raw and wounded beneath. "You want to talk about murder, boy? Let me tell you about murder. My son Thomas was 12 years old when he died. 12. He trusted the men who built that bridge, trusted the company that approved the materials, trusted a system that valued profit over safety. His last words as I held him in the wreckage were asking if we'd built it wrong, if his death was our fault." Crane's voice broke, genuine anguish pouring through. "I've spent 4 years ensuring no other father has to feel what I felt. Your mother's land provides the only safe route through this region. Every other option requires cutting corners, risking lives. Her stubbornness isn't just inconvenient, it's potentially murderous." "My father died protecting people," Ethan said quietly. "He understood that sometimes the right thing costs more than the easy thing. You dishonor your son's memory by using his death to justify taking from others." Crane's face hardened. Noble words from a boy who's never lost anyone he truly loved. "Sign the papers or I'll teach you exactly what loss feels like." "No." The single word hung in the clearing like smoke. Kane's hand tightened on his pistol. Torres stopped pacing, his young face troubled. Morrison shifted his weight, the movement of a man preparing for violence. Then the world exploded into chaos. The shot came from impossible distance, from a direction none of them had been watching. Luther Kane stood with his Remington revolver halfway clear of its holster when the bullet struck. Not his hand, not his body, but the weapon itself. The precision was so absolute that the revolver spun from his grip without the bullet touching flesh, clattering into the dirt 6 feet away. For one frozen heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Kane dove for his fallen gun just as a second shot kicked it farther away, the bullet's impact sending up a spray of pine needles and soil. The message was unmistakable. The shooter could have killed him twice already. They'd chosen not to. "Scatter!" Crane shouted, his composure shattering completely. "Find that shooter!" But Vernon Blackwood had planned for this moment with the meticulous attention to detail that had kept him alive through 3 wars. as Kane and Torres crashed into the undergrowth, searching for Sarah's position. They triggered tripwires that released carefully balanced logs, stones, and netting. Torres went down hard, a hemp net, tangling his legs and arms. Kane dodged the first trap, but ran straight into a second, a rope snare that caught his ankle and jerked him off his feet. Morrison charged toward where he thought the shot originated, his massive size making him confident in his ability to overwhelm any opponent through sheer physical dominance. He crashed through 20 yards of dense brush before the ground gave way beneath him, a covered pit, dropping him 8 feet into a hole Vernon and Thomas had dug years earlier for exactly this purpose. The fall wouldn't kill him, but climbing out would take time he didn't have. In the chaos, Dalton grabbed Ethan and hauled him toward cover, cutting the loose bonds as they ran. "Stay down and trust the plan," Dalton hissed. "Your mother knows what she's doing." 600 yards away, Sarah Whitehorse worked the lever action of her Winchester with mechanical precision, ejecting spent brass and chambering fresh rounds. The distance was extreme, pushing the absolute limits of what even the finest rifle and scope could accomplish. Wind gusted unpredictably through the canyon, adding variables that would make most shooters give up. But Sarah had spent 20 years mastering this weapon, learning its quirks and capabilities until it felt like an extension of her own body. Through the scope, she tracked Crane as he ran for his horse. Not to escape, she realized, but to retrieve something from his saddlebags. A rifle of his own, an expensive Winchester that probably cost more than most men earned in a year. He was done negotiating, done with subtlety. Now he wanted blood. Sarah adjusted her aim point, calculating distance and wind drift with instincts honed by thousands of practice shots. The mathematics were complex, but her hands made the corrections without conscious thought. Breathe in, breathe out. Find the still point between heartbeats. The world narrowed to the circle of the scope, to the target, to the terrible intimacy of holding another human's life in the pressure of a single finger. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet covered 6 football fields in less than a second, its trajectory a perfect arc that accounted for gravity's pull and wind's push. It struck Crane's rifle exactly where barrel met stock, shattering the mechanism and sending the weapon spinning from his hands. The impact knocked Crane backward unharmed, but thoroughly shocked. Vernon's voice boomed from somewhere in the trees, amplified by the acoustics of the canyon walls. "Next shot won't be a warning, Crane. Your men are down or running. You're alone. Surrender now, or find out what happens when you threaten a white horse." For a long moment, Crane stood frozen in the clearing, staring at his shattered rifle. Then his gaze lifted, searching the distant ridgeline for the source of the impossible shots. Sarah remained perfectly still, knowing that at this distance she was effectively invisible against the rocky backdrop. But she watched Crane through her scope, saw the moment when understanding finally penetrated his desperation. He was beaten, outmaneuvered, outgunned, and out of options. The widow he'd thought vulnerable had revealed herself to be something else entirely. Something dangerous. Torres, struggling free of the net that had trapped him, raised his hands in surrender. "I'm done," he shouted. "Kane Morrison, whoever can hear me, I'm done. This is madness," Morrison's voice echoed from the pit. "I can't get out. Someone throw me a rope or I'm stuck here till next week." Only Kane remained defiant, having finally freed himself from the snare. He crouched behind a boulder, pistol in hand, scanning for targets. "Cowards," he snarled. "It's one woman and some tricks. We can still take them." "No," came a new voice, calm and authoritative. Marshal James Everett emerged from cover, his badge catching the morning sunlight. His own pistol was drawn but pointed safely at the ground. "It's over, Kane. You're surrounded by federal law, outgunned by someone who shoots better than you ever will. And your employer is about to face charges that'll see him in territorial prison for a decade. Put down the weapon and walk away while you still can." Kane's eyes darted between Everett, the distant ridgeline, where Sarah maintained overwatch, and Crane's defeated posture. The calculation was visible on his scarred face. He was a professional who understood when a job had gone sideways beyond recovery. Slowly, with obvious reluctance, he placed his pistol on the ground and raised his hands. "Smart choice," Everett said. "Now step away from the weapon and get on your knees." As Everett's deputies emerged to secure the prisoners, Vernon appeared beside Crane. The old colonel looked at the broken man with something that might have been pity. "You came here believing money and force could take what didn't belong to you," Vernon said quietly. "You forgot that some things can't be bought or stolen. Land earned by 3 generations of sweat and blood. A woman's honor. A family's legacy. These things are defended by more than legal papers and hired guns." Crane looked up, his face haggard. "I just wanted to build something safe, something that would honor my son's memory." "Then build it somewhere else," Vernon replied. "Build it on land freely given with money honestly paid. Honor your boy by becoming the man he thought you were, not the monster grief has made you." Before Crane could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. A group of riders emerged from the eastern trail, perhaps a dozen men in expensive suits, accompanied by armed escorts. At their head rode Mayor Franklin Walsh, his florid face showing satisfaction that suggested he expected to find burned buildings and broken resistance. Beside Walsh rode a silver-haired gentleman in his 60s, carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of authority. The territorial governor had arrived exactly on schedule for Crane's planned coup. But instead of finding evidence of outlaw activity and abandoned property, he found U.S. Marshal Everett standing over bound prisoners while a woman with a rifle maintained overwatch from the high ground. Walsh's satisfied expression transformed into confusion, then growing horror as he took in the scene. The governor's sharp eyes missed nothing, cataloging every detail with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to political complications. "Marshal Everett," the governor said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of an Eastern education. "I was informed this property had been attacked by outlaws. This appears to be something else entirely." "Indeed it is, Governor Hayes," Everett replied. "What you're witnessing is the aftermath of an attempted land grab, using hired guns and fraudulent legal claims. Mr. Silas Crane here, working in cooperation with Mayor Walsh, tried to force Mrs. Sarah Whitehorse to sell property that's been in her family for 3 generations. When she refused, they escalated to violence." Walsh's face went pale. "That's a lie. I was simply trying to facilitate progress for the territory." "You were facilitating your own bank account," Everett countered. "We have testimony from Mr. Cole Dalton, one of Crane's hired men, detailing the entire scheme, including your planned use of emergency powers to declare this property abandoned so you could force a sale." Governor Hayes turned his cold gaze on Walsh. "Is this true, Franklin?" The mayor opened his mouth, closed it, then seemed to deflate like a punctured bladder. "Governor, I can explain. The railroad is vital to our territory's future. Certain compromises had to be made." "Compromises?" Hayes repeated, his voice dripping contempt. "Is that what we're calling conspiracy and attempted theft now?" A new figure appeared on the ridgeline, silhouetted against the brightening sky. Sarah Whitehorse stood there with her rifle visible now that the immediate danger had passed. Even at this distance, her presence commanded attention, the morning light seeming to gather around her like a corona. Governor Hayes studied her for a long moment, then did something that shocked everyone present. He removed his hat and inclined his head in a gesture of respect. "Mrs. Whitehorse," he called, "would you do me the honor of coming down here so we can discuss this matter properly?" As Sarah descended from her position, moving with the easy confidence of someone completely in control of their terrain, Crane finally broke. He sank to his knees, all the fight draining out of him like water from a broken vessel. The great businessman, the railroad magnate, the grieving father trying to build a monument to his lost son, reduced to a broken man, facing the ruin of everything he'd tried to accomplish. But even in defeat, a new threat was already taking shape. Because lurking at the back of the governor's entourage, watching everything with calculating eyes, was a face that Vernon Blackwood recognized from old and ugly memories. The scorpion had finally revealed himself, and he wore the face of someone they'd all trusted. The real battle, Vernon realized with cold certainty, hadn't ended. It had only just begun. The man standing at the back of Governor Hayes' entourage wore the clothes of a territorial bureaucrat, forgettable and gray. But Vernon Blackwood hadn't survived 3 wars by forgetting faces, and this one triggered memories that made his hand drift toward his pistol. Franklin Walsh, the mayor who'd supposedly been Crane's partner in this scheme, was moving with the confidence of someone who held cards nobody else knew existed. Sarah descended from the ridge with measured steps, her Winchester held in a way that suggested respect for the governor while maintaining readiness for violence. Ethan moved to intercept her, positioning himself between his mother and the assembled group. Dalton and Marshal Everett flanked them, creating a protective formation that was both subtle and unmistakable. Governor Hayes studied Sarah with the keen assessment of a man accustomed to reading people. What he saw made him nod slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "Mrs. Whitehorse, I've reviewed the documents Mayor Walsh provided regarding your property. He claims irregularities in your late husband's land, grant questions about tribal treaty violations, concerns about proper survey markers. I came here expecting to find those claims validated by evidence of property abandonment. Instead, I find what appears to be an organized attempt at theft through legal manipulation." "That's exactly what it is, Governor," Sarah replied, her voice carrying across the clearing with quiet authority. "My husband's grant was filed in 1862 under the Homestead Act, signed by President Lincoln himself. It predates every treaty Mayor Walsh is citing by 2 decades. Walsh stepped forward, his earlier nervousness replaced by something harder, more calculating. "Governor, with respect, Mrs. Whitehorse's interpretation is incomplete. The land in question sits on territory that was reclassified in 1879 following new surveys. Her grant, while initially valid, falls into a legal gray area that requires territorial adjudication." "Legal gray area," Vernon said, his voice cutting through Walsh's explanation like a knife. "Interesting phrase for outright fraud, Franklin." The mayor's eyes found Vernon, and something cold flickered there. "Colonel Blackwood, I'd wondered if you'd involve yourself in this mess, still playing knight-errant for lost causes. Still recognizing corruption when I see it," Vernon replied. "The question is whether Governor Hayes has the same gift." Hayes raised a hand, silencing further argument. "I'd like to see these original documents if they still exist. Land grants from the Lincoln administration should be in the territorial archives, but Mayor Walsh assures me they've been lost or misfiled." "How convenient," Sarah said. "Fortunately, my husband kept copies, multiple copies in multiple locations, because he understood men like Walsh would someday try exactly this." She gestured to Vernon, who produced a leather portfolio from inside his coat. The documents within were yellowed with age but perfectly preserved, each page bearing official seals and signatures that would be impossible to forge. Thomas Whitehorse had been thorough, and his foresight was about to save his family's legacy. Hayes accepted the portfolio and began reading, his expression growing increasingly grim. Walsh watched with mounting tension, his confident facade developing cracks. Crane, still kneeling in the dirt with his shattered rifle beside him, looked between them with the confused expression of a man realizing he'd been a pawn in a much larger game. "These appear authentic," Hayes said finally. "Federal land grant properly registered with survey marks that match territorial records. Mrs. Whitehorse, your claim is not only valid, it's ironclad. No territorial authority can supersede federal law." Governor Walsh said, urgency creeping into his voice. "I must protest. There are procedures, reviews, appeal processes that must be followed before such a determination can be made." "Must there?" Hayes's voice carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "Tell me, Franklin, what's your personal interest in seeing this particular piece of property change hands? Because I'm beginning to suspect Mr. Crane here wasn't the only party with financial motivations." The clearing fell silent. In that silence, pieces clicked together in Vernon's mind with the terrible clarity of long-delayed recognition. The Scorpion wasn't just a guide hired by Crane. The Scorpion was Walsh himself, working both sides of the conflict, using Crane's grief and desperation as cover for his own scheme. "Water rights," Vernon said quietly. "This isn't about railroads at all, is it, Franklin? It's about controlling the mesa's springs and the creek that flows from them. Whitehorse land sits at the headwaters. Whoever owns this property controls water access for half the territory." Walsh's face transformed civility, dropping away to reveal something predatory beneath. "Very astute, Colonel, but unfortunately your cleverness comes too late." The mayor's hand moved with surprising speed, drawing a concealed revolver from beneath his coat. The weapon barked once the shot echoing across the clearing. Silas Crane jerked backward, a red stain spreading across his expensive vest. He looked down at the wound with almost comical surprise, then toppled sideways into the dirt. "No!" Torres shouted, lunging toward Crane's fallen form, but Walsh's gun tracked to him, and the young gunman froze. "Nobody move," Walsh commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Governor, I apologize for the dramatics, but Mr. Crane was about to become inconvenient." A shame, really. He served his purpose admirably. Hayes stood utterly still, his face pale but composed. "Franklin, whatever you think you're accomplishing here, it ends in a noose. You've just murdered a man in front of a territorial governor and a U.S. Marshal." "Have I?" Walsh smiled, the expression chilling in its complete lack of humor. "Or have I simply defended myself and my governor from a dangerous criminal who pulled a weapon? So many witnesses, such confusion in the chaos." Stories can be told many different ways. Marshal Everett's hand moved toward his pistol, but Walsh's gun swung to cover him. "I wouldn't, James. Your deputies are well trained, I'm sure, but my men have been positioning themselves while everyone focused on poor Mr. Crane's theatrics. Look around. Count the guns aimed at your people. Then decide if you want to see how this plays out." For the first time, Vernon truly surveyed their surroundings. Walsh's escort wasn't just ceremonial. 8 men, in addition to the mayor, all armed, all now with weapons drawn or hands hovering near holsters. They'd walked into a trap baited with legal documents and righteous indignation, never seeing the real threat until it was too late. "What do you want, Walsh?" Sarah asked, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "What I've always wanted. What this territory needs. Control of the water that will determine whether communities thrive or die. Your land sits on the last major aquifer between here and the Colorado River. Whoever controls those springs controls the future of Arizona territory. I've spent 5 years acquiring surrounding properties through shell companies and proxies. Your stubborn family is the final piece." He gestured with the revolver, the movement casual, but no less deadly for its ease. "Here's what happens next. You sign transfer documents giving me clear title to Whitehorse land. The governor witnesses the transaction, making it legally binding. Then everyone rides away and we pretend this unfortunate incident with Mr. Crane never happened." "And if we refuse?" Ethan demanded. His young face flushed with anger and fear. Walsh's smile widened. "Then I'm afraid there will be more unfortunate incidents. So many, in fact, that by the time the territorial militia arrives to investigate, they'll find only bodies and burned buildings." Tragic, but these frontier conflicts do get out of hand sometimes. Vernon calculated angles and odds with the speed of long practice. 8 guns against 4 with innocent civilians in the crossfire. Even if Sarah took 3 shots in 3 seconds, even if Everett and his deputies reacted perfectly, people would die. Probably many people. The mathematics of violence were brutally simple. But Vernon Blackwood had learned long ago that the best victories are won before the first shot is fired. "Before you commit to this course," Vernon said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had commanded soldiers through desperate battles, "let me share something interesting about federal land grants, Franklin. They're not just property deeds, they're contracts with the United States government. When you threaten a federal grant holder, you're not just breaking territorial law. You're committing treason against federal authority." Walsh laughed. "Legal semantics from a desperate old man. How touching." "Not semantics, fact." Vernon pulled another document from his coat, this one bearing seals that made Walsh's eyes narrow. "This is a telegram I received yesterday from the Department of the Interior. They've been investigating irregularities in Arizona Territory land transactions for 6 months. Your name appears 47 times in connection with fraudulent transfers and water right manipulations. You're not just a corrupt Mayor Franklin. You're the target of a federal investigation." For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Walsh's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" "Then explain why 3 federal marshals rode into Copper Ridge this morning with arrest warrants. James here is territorial. They're federal. And they're currently securing your office, your bank records, and your shell company documents as we speak." It was a magnificent bluff, built on fragments of truth and delivered with absolute conviction. Vernon had indeed received telegrams about federal investigations, though their scope and timing were considerably less dramatic than he suggested. But Walsh didn't know that, and doubt was a weapon as powerful as any gun. Walsh's composure cracked further. His gun hand trembled slightly, the weapon's barrel wavering between targets. No, you're lying. This is a trick." "Only one way to find out," Everett said quietly. "Lower your weapon, surrender peacefully, and we'll sort this out through proper legal channels. Or pull that trigger and guarantee yourself a federal noose regardless of what other charges stick." The clearing balanced on a knife's edge, violence held back by the thinnest thread of uncertainty. Then Walsh's face hardened with the terrible resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. "Then I'll take as many of you with me as I can," he snarled. "Kill them all." The clearing erupted into chaos. Walsh's men drew weapons as Everett and his deputies scattered for cover. Vernon grabbed Governor Hayes and pulled him down behind a fallen log as bullets tore through the space they'd occupied seconds before. Ethan dove toward Sarah, shielding his mother with his own body in a gesture that would have made Thomas Whitehorse proud. But Sarah was already moving her Winchester, coming up with fluid grace. She fired once, the shot perfectly placed to disarm rather than kill. One of Walsh's men screamed as his pistol flew from his hand, the weapon's grip shattered by a bullet that never touched flesh. "Fall back to the caves," Vernon shouted. "Everyone fall back now." They ran a desperate scramble toward the hidden entrance that Vernon and Thomas had prepared for exactly this contingency. Bullets chased them through the underbrush, bark and stone exploding as Walsh's men fired with abandon. Torres and Morrison, despite being prisoners moments before, ran with them, survival instinct overriding legal status. The cave entrance was a narrow crack in the mesa's face, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Vernon reached it first, hauling Hayes through with strength that belied his age. Ethan and Sarah followed, then Everett and his deputies, then finally Dalton, dragging a wounded Torres, whose leg bore a graze from someone's wild shot. Behind them, Walsh's voice carried through the morning air, shrill with rage and desperation. "Seal that entrance! I want them trapped like rats!" Inside the cave, Vernon led them deeper into darkness, producing oil lamps from cached supplies that cast dancing shadows on limestone walls. The passage widened after 50 feet, opening into the main chamber that had served as a Whitehorse stronghold for 3 generations. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a steady percussion that marked time with indifferent patience. "How long can we hold?" Ethan asked, checking his rifle's magazine. "Depends on whether Walsh is stupid enough to assault a defended position," Vernon replied. "This entrance is narrow enough that one person with a rifle can hold off 20. But if he's smart, he'll try to starve us out or find another way in." "There is another way in," Sarah said quietly. "The Western Passage. Your map showed it collapsed, but Thomas told me he kept it partially clear. An escape route if the main entrance was ever compromised." Vernon's face showed surprise, then grudging respect. That man thought of everything. But if we know about it, Walsh might too if he's the Scorpion. He's been operating in this territory for years, mapping everything, learning every secret. "Then we defend both positions," Everett said. "Deputy Clark, take Morrison and cover the western passage. Dalton, you're with them. Anyone comes through, you give them a reason to regret it." As the men dispersed to their positions, Sarah moved to a vantage point where a natural chimney in the rock provided a shooting position overlooking the cave entrance. 30 feet of stone corridor stretched below a killing ground for anyone foolish enough to try forcing entry. Outside, Walsh organized his assault. His voice carried into the cave promises of mercy alternating with threats of violence. The territorial governor was in his hands now, a valuable hostage if negotiations became necessary. But first, he needed to break the defender's will. "Sarah Whitehorse," Walsh called, "you're only delaying the inevitable surrender now, and I'll let your boy live." Sarah's response was a single shot that kicked up dust inches from where Walsh stood, visible as a shadow against the cave entrance's light. The mayor jerked back with a yelp of surprise. "I believe Mrs. Whitehorse has answered your offer," Vernon called. "Perhaps you'd like to try a different approach, one that doesn't end with you bleeding in the dirt." Walsh's reply was predictable. His men opened fire bullets, ricocheting off stone and screaming through the cave entrance. But Vernon had chosen this position specifically for its defensive advantages. The angle was wrong for accurate shooting, the distance too great for pistols, and Sarah's return fire made approaching the entrance suicidal. The siege settled into a tense standoff. Walsh's men took cover behind rocks and trees, firing occasionally to keep the defenders pinned, but unwilling to risk the narrow entrance. Inside the cave, Vernon gathered his small command. "We have water, ammunition, and cached supplies for 3 days," he said. "Walsh has numbers and time. The question is, which resource runs out first?" "There's another question," Sarah said. "What happened to Crane?" Torres, his wounded leg bandaged by Everett, spoke up from his position against the cave wall. "He was still breathing when we ran. Gut shot, but alive. If Walsh leaves him there, he'll die slow." "Then we can't stay here," Ethan said immediately. "We have to get help for him." "Admirable sentiment," Vernon replied, "but tactically unsound. Breaking cover now would be suicide." "The boy's right, though," Everett said. "Walsh just shot a man in front of witnesses, including the territorial governor. If Crane dies and we survive to testify, Walsh hangs regardless of what happens with the land. But if Crane lives and we're all dead, Walsh controls the narrative." The implication settled over them like a shroud. They weren't just defending property anymore. They were the only witnesses to murder, the only people who could bring Franklin Walsh to justice. Which meant Walsh had to kill them all or lose everything. As if reading their thoughts, Walsh's voice echoed into the cave again. "I'm a patient man, Mrs. Whitehorse. I can wait, but Mr. Crane out here can't. Every minute you delay is another minute closer to his death, and when he dies, his blood is on your hands, not mine." Sarah looked to Vernon, a question in her eyes. The old colonel studied the cave entrance, calculating angles and possibilities with the mind that had orchestrated victories against impossible odds. "There might be a way," he said slowly, "but it requires perfect timing, absolute precision, and more luck than any sane person would count on." "Tell me," Sarah said simply. Vernon's plan was audacious to the point of madness, but it had the virtue of being unexpected, which in warfare was often worth more than superior numbers. They would create a diversion at the main entrance, drawing Walsh's attention and fire, while Dalton, Ethan, and one of Everett's deputies made a break from the western passage to reach Crane's position. If they could get the wounded man to cover, he might survive long enough for reinforcements to arrive. "And if reinforcements don't arrive?" Ethan asked. "Then we've bought him time to make peace with his maker," Vernon replied grimly. "Not the best outcome, but better than leaving him to die alone." The diversion would be Sarah's responsibility. 10 shots perfectly placed, designed to make Walsh's men believe the cave defenders were attempting a breakout. Each shot had to land exactly where Vernon calculated, creating a pattern of suppression that would force Walsh's forces to reposition, opening a window for the rescue team to move. Sarah checked her ammunition. 10 rounds in the Winchester's magazine, 10 more on her belt. 20 bullets to convince professional gunmen They were facing an overwhelming assault rather than a single woman with a rifle. The mathematics were brutal, but she'd faced worse odds before. "When you're ready," Vernon said, moving to the position where he'd direct the timing. Sarah settled into her shooting stance, the rifle an extension of her body, her breathing steady despite the stakes. Through the cave entrance, she could see flickers of movement as Walsh's men maintained their positions. They were confident, comfortable, certain that time was on their side. They were about to learn that confidence could be fatal when facing someone who never missed. "Now," Vernon said quietly. The Winchester spoke, and the siege transformed into something far more desperate than Franklin Walsh had ever imagined. Sarah's first shot took the hat off a man crouched behind a ponderosa pine 40 yards from the cave entrance. The bullet's passage was so precise that he felt the wind of its passing before the hat even hit the ground. He dropped flat, shouting a warning that turned Walsh's organized siege into panicked chaos. The second shot struck a rifle stock, splintering wood, and sending the weapon spinning from hands that suddenly seemed far too vulnerable. The third shattered a canteen water, spraying like blood in the morning sunlight. 4, 5, 6, each bullet landing exactly where Vernon had calculated, creating a pattern of suppression that made Walsh's men believe they faced multiple shooters with overlapping fields of fire. "They're breaking out," one of Walsh's hired guns shouted, abandoning his position to seek better cover. Others followed the careful positions they'd maintained, collapsing as survival instinct overrode tactical discipline. In that moment of chaos, 3 figures burst from the western passage of the cave system. Ethan ran with the desperate speed of youth, Dalton beside him, moving with the economy of experience, and Deputy Clark bringing up the rear with his rifle sweeping for threats. They covered 50 yards before Walsh's men even realized the diversion's true purpose. Silas Crane lay where he'd fallen, his expensive suit soaked with blood that pooled beneath him in the dust. His breathing was shallow, labored, the sound of a man whose body was fighting a battle it was slowly losing. But his eyes were open, aware, watching the sky with the strange clarity that sometimes comes when death stands close. "We've got you," Ethan said, sliding to his knees beside the fallen man. "Just hold on." Crane's lips moved words barely audible. "Why I try to destroy everything you love?" "Because my father taught me that honor doesn't pick and choose," Ethan replied, pulling bandages from the medical kit Dalton had carried. "You were wrong, Mr. Crane, but being wrong doesn't mean you deserve to die alone in the dirt." Dalton provided covering fire as Walsh's men realized what was happening. Bullets kicked up earth around them, angry hornets seeking flesh. But Deputy Clark's rifle spoke with authority, and somewhere in the cave entrance, Sarah's Winchester continued its deadly work, each shot perfectly placed to keep attackers at bay. "Move him!" Dalton shouted. "We can't stay exposed." Between them they lifted Crane, the wounded man, groaning as movement reopened his injury. But there was a boulder cluster 20 yards distant, solid cover if they could reach it. Ethan and Deputy Clark took Crane's weight while Dalton walked backward, his pistol barking defiance at anyone foolish enough to show themselves. They made the shelter with bullets whining overhead like demons denied their prize. Behind the rocks, Ethan worked with shaking hands to pack Crane's wound, using every skill his mother had taught him about frontier medicine. The bleeding slowed, but didn't stop. Crane needed a doctor, needed surgery, needed things they couldn't provide in the middle of a gunfight. "Just keep pressure on it," Dalton instructed, his eyes never leaving the battlefield. Vernon's plan called for 15 minutes of diversion. "We're at 8. 7 more minutes and reinforcements arrive, or we're on our own." "What reinforcements?" Ethan demanded. "There's nobody else." Dalton's grim smile suggested he knew something Ethan didn't. Never underestimate what a determined old soldier can arrange. Vernon didn't survive 3 wars by failing to plan for contingencies. Inside the cave, Sarah reloaded her Winchester with fresh ammunition Vernon had cached here years ago. For this diversion, she had 20 rounds, 18 to create the illusion of overwhelming force. 2 held in reserve for emergencies, and Walsh's men were beginning to understand they'd been played. Anger replaced fear, and angry men made stupid decisions that could turn deadly. "They're massing for an assault," Vernon observed, watching through a gap in the rocks. "They'll rush the entrance in the next 60 seconds. Can you hold them?" "2 bullets," Sarah replied calmly. "Choose the targets." Vernon pointed to 2 men who were clearly organizing the assault, giving orders, and positioning others for the attack. Leaders. Take them out of the equation, and the others might lose their nerve. Sarah's 19th shot struck the first man's rifle exactly where the trigger guard met the stock, the impact numbing his hand and sending the weapon clattering away. The 20th and final bullet performed the same service for the second leader, this one at a slightly greater distance that required Sarah to account for an updraft in the canyon. Both men stared at their empty hands, then at the cave entrance, where death had twice reached out and touched them with surgical precision, but had chosen to spare them. The message was unmistakable. If the defenders had wanted them dead, they would be dead. The assault broke before it began, men losing their stomach for attacking a position held by someone who could hit what they aimed at from impossible distances. Walsh's voice rose in fury, demanding they advance, threatening consequences for cowardice. But professional gunmen know the difference between bravery and suicide, and none of them were being paid enough to test which this was. Then the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon, and everything changed. A column of riders emerged from the eastern trail, perhaps 20 strong, led by a man wearing the silver star of a U.S. Marshal on his chest. But this wasn't Everett's local authority. These were federal marshals, the kind who answered to Washington, rather than territorial governors, and their presence transformed Walsh's rebellion into something far more serious than a land dispute. The lead marshal reined in his horse, surveying the scene with the cold assessment of someone accustomed to violent situations. His eyes found Walsh, found the wounded Crane, found the scattered positions of hired guns who suddenly realized they'd picked the wrong side of a federal case. "Franklin Walsh," the marshal called his voice, carrying authority that brooked no argument. "By order of the Department of the Interior and the Attorney General of the United States, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder of federal grant holders, and corruption of territorial office. Drop your weapons and surrender peacefully, or we will take you by force." Walsh's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally a trapped animal's desperate calculation. His hand tightened on his revolver, and for a moment it seemed he might choose the suicide of resistance over the humiliation of capture. But Vernon Blackwood had other plans. The old colonel emerged from the cave entrance, moving with purpose despite his years. He held no weapon, presented no threat, but his bearing commanded attention. "It's over, Franklin," Vernon said, his voice almost gentle. "Your shell companies have been traced, your bank accounts frozen, your conspirators already giving testimony to save their own skins. The federal investigation I mentioned. It was real. The marshals arrived in Copper Ridge yesterday, just as I said. You've lost. The only question now is whether you face a judge or a firing squad." Walsh's gun hand trembled. Around him, his hired men were laying down weapons, hands raised in surrender. Even the most hardened professional knows when the game has ended. Only Walsh himself remained defiant, caught between pride and reality. Then a new sound cut through the tension, hoofbeats coming fast from the south. A single rider pushed his horse to its limits, the animal lathered and blowing, but still running on heart alone. The rider wore the simple clothes of a town physician, his medical bag bouncing against his saddle. "I came as fast as I could," Dr. Samuel Brennan called, sliding from his horse before it fully stopped. Vernon's telegram said there were wounded who needed immediate attention. The doctor's eyes found Crane behind the boulder, found the spreading blood stain, and his professional demeanor shifted into emergency mode. He ran to the wounded man, Ethan, making room as Brennan's experienced hands began their work. "Gut shot, but the bullet missed major organs," Brennan muttered, probing the wound with practiced efficiency. "He's lost blood, but he'll live if I can get him to my surgery within the hour. You there?" He pointed at 2 of the federal marshals. "I need a stretcher improvised, and this man transported gently. Move like you're carrying your own mother." As the marshals worked to create a transport, Walsh's resistance finally crumbled. He dropped his revolver, the weapon thudding into the dust with the finality of a closing coffin lid. Federal marshals moved in, securing his hands with iron cuffs that clicked shut with bureaucratic precision. "I want my lawyer," Walsh said, his voice hollow. "I have rights." "You do." The lead federal marshal agreed. "Right to counsel, right to trial, right to face your accusers, all provided in accordance with federal law. What you don't have anymore is the right to terrorize honest citizens or corrupt territorial government." Governor Hayes emerged from the cave supported by Marshal Everett. The territorial governor's dignity was intact despite the circumstances, and his face showed the cold fury of a man whose office had been abused for criminal purposes. Marshal Hayes addressed the federal officer, "I will personally ensure full territorial cooperation with your investigation. Mayor Walsh's conspiracy appears to extend deep into county government. I want every official he appointed investigated, every decision he influenced reviewed." "Already underway, Governor," the marshal replied. "We've had agents working this case for 6 months. Today was simply the culmination." Vernon moved to stand beside Sarah, who had emerged from the cave with her empty Winchester. The old colonel's face showed satisfaction, but also something that made Sarah's eyes narrow with concern. "Vernon," she said quietly, "you're hurt." Only then did Ethan notice the dark stain spreading across Vernon's left side, hidden by the way he held his coat. The old soldier had taken a bullet during the siege, probably a ricochet off the cave walls, and had said nothing while continuing to command the defense. "It's nothing," Vernon said, waving away concern. "Seen far worse and kept fighting." "Nothing, my foot," Dr. Brennan snapped, having heard the exchange. "Colonel Vernon Blackwood, you stubborn old warhorse, sit down before you fall down. That's an order from someone who outranks you in matters of not dying stupidly." Vernon allowed himself to be guided to a flat rock where Brennan's examination revealed a deep graze along his ribs. Painful, bloody, but mercifully not life-threatening. The doctor worked with efficient hands bandaging the wound while muttering about stubborn soldiers who thought themselves invincible. "You could have died," Sarah said, kneeling beside her old friend. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because," Vernon replied with a slight smile. "If I'd shown weakness, the others might have lost heart. A commander's first duty is to maintain morale. Besides, Thomas made me promise to watch over you and the boy. Can't very well do that from a sickbed, can I?" Sarah's eyes glistened with tears she refused to shed in public. "Thomas chose his friends well. He chose his wife better," Vernon countered. "I've known a lot of soldiers in my time, Sarah. Brave men, skilled fighters, tactical geniuses. But I've never known anyone who could make a rifle sing the way you do. Thomas used to say you were the finest shot he'd ever seen. I think he undersold you. You're probably the finest shot anyone has ever seen." The compliment, coming from a man who'd commanded armies and witnessed legendary marksmen, meant more than Vernon perhaps realized. Sarah gripped his hand, the gesture simple but profound. Ethan stood nearby, watching the exchange with new understanding. His mother wasn't just defending their land. She was honoring the memory of his father and the bonds of friendship that transcended death itself. And Vernon, wounded and exhausted, had risked everything because of a promise made to a friend years ago. This was what legacy meant. Not property or possessions, but the obligations we accept and the promises we keep even when keeping them costs dearly. Silas Crane was loaded onto an improvised stretcher, his face gray with pain, but his eyes clearer than they'd been since this whole nightmare began. As the marshals prepared to transport him to Dr. Brennan's surgery, Crane gestured weakly for Sarah to approach. "Mrs. Whitehorse," he said, his voice barely audible, "I owe you my life. You could have left me to die. Should have given what I tried to do to your family." "My husband spent 2 years investigating your son's death," Sarah said, reaching into her coat pocket. She produced a sealed envelope yellowed with age. "He compiled evidence, took statements, traced the corruption that led to that bridge collapse. He never got to deliver it because he died before finishing the case, but the work was complete. She placed the envelope in Crane's trembling hands. The men who cut corners, who approved faulty materials, who killed your boy for profit, their names are in there. So is enough evidence to see them prosecuted. Thomas wanted justice for your son, Mr. Crane. He just didn't live to deliver it himself. Crane stared at the envelope, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. Why would he do this for a stranger's child? Because that's what honor demands, Sarah replied simply. Justice for all or justice for none. My husband believed that. He died believing it. And I'll be damned if I let his work go to waste because the man who benefited from it temporarily lost his way. As the stretcher-bearers carried Crane toward the waiting wagon, the broken man clutched the envelope like a sacred relic. He'd come to Shadowpine Mesa seeking to build a monument to his dead son. Instead, he'd been given something far more precious, the truth and the means to achieve real justice. Governor Hayes approached Sarah, his bearing formal, but his eyes showing genuine respect. Mrs. Whitehorse, I owe you an apology. I allowed myself to be misled by a corrupt official and nearly facilitated a grave injustice. That fails both my office and my personal honor. You came when summoned, Governor, Sarah replied. You saw the truth when it was revealed. That's all any of us can do. Hayes produced an official-looking document from his coat. Nevertheless, I'm issuing an executive order. The Whitehorse land grant is hereby recognized as federally protected property in perpetuity. No territorial authority, no federal agency, no corporate interest can challenge your ownership without direct presidential approval. Your family's claim is now as secure as law can make it. He handed her the document, his signature and seal making it binding. Additionally, surveys have confirmed significant mineral deposits on your property. Gold, silver, possibly copper. Under federal law, those resources belong to you. You're now one of the wealthiest landowners in Arizona Territory. Sarah accepted the document but showed little interest in the wealth it represented. The land was never about gold, Governor. It's about legacy, about honoring the people who came before and preserving something for those who come after. A sentiment this territory would do well to remember, Hayes said. Thank you, Mrs. Whitehorse, for your courage, your integrity, and your reminder that some things cannot be bought or stolen. There's one more thing you should know, Mrs. Whitehorse, Hayes said, producing a second document. During the investigation, we discovered why Walsh was so obsessed with this specific land. It's not just the water rights. He unfolded an old Spanish map, yellowed with age. Your property sits on what the Apache called sacred ground. The springs here were used for ceremonies for generations. More than that, Spanish conquistadors hid gold here in the 1600s stolen from Apache peoples. That gold is still here somewhere in your caves. Sarah studied the map, then looked Hayes in the eye. Then it belongs to the Apache Nation, not to me. My claim is to the surface land my family built on. What lies beneath what was stolen from others should return to its rightful owners. Hayes smiled with genuine respect. That decision, Mrs. Whitehorse, proves exactly why this land is safe in your hands. As the governor moved away to coordinate with the federal marshals, Marshal James Everett approached with Ethan at his side. The lawman's face showed the satisfaction of a job well done, but also something more personal. Sarah, I've been authorized to offer young Ethan here a position as deputy marshal. Territorial appointment, working under my supervision. The boy's proven himself today, shown courage and judgment beyond his years. Ethan's eyes lit with excitement, but he looked to his mother for approval. Sarah studied her son, seeing not the boy who'd played in these hills, but the man who'd risked his life to save an enemy because it was the right thing to do. Your father would be proud, she said finally. But you have to promise me something, Ethan. Promise you'll finish learning everything I have to teach you before you pin on that badge. A deputy marshal needs more than courage. He needs skills that keep him alive when courage isn't enough. I promise, Ma, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. Every lesson, every shot, every tracking technique, I'll learn it all. Then you have my blessing, Sarah replied. Serve with honor. Make the White Horse name mean something to the people you protect. Cole Dalton approached as the marshals prepared to depart with their prisoners. The former Pinkerton man had been cleared of charges given his cooperation and his late decision to honor Thomas Whitehorse's memory. He carried his hat in his hands, the gesture of a man humbled by events. Before Dalton rode north, he approached Sarah one final time. "Mrs. Whitehorse, I need to ask you something. During the Apache campaigns 15 years back, there was a scout. They called her Ghost because she could track anything and shoot like the hand of God himself. The Army kept her identity secret, but—" He paused, studying her face. "That was you, wasn't it, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, before you married Thomas?" Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her eyes confirmed what Dalton suspected. "That was a lifetime ago. A different war, different enemies." "Not so different," Dalton replied quietly. "You were already a legend then. Now I understand why Thomas said his wife was the most dangerous person he'd ever known. He wasn't boasting. He was warning anyone foolish enough to threaten his family. Mrs. Whitehorse, I wanted to say goodbye before I head north. I've got an offer to be sheriff up in Oregon Territory. Quiet town, good people, honest work. Seems like it's time I tried living by the code I used to believe in." "Your help today saved lives," Sarah said, "including my son's. That debt won't be forgotten." "No debt," Dalton replied. "Just evening accounts with a man who deserved better than I gave him. Thomas Whitehorse earned my loyalty years ago. Today, I finally repaid it." As Dalton rode north toward his new life, Vernon sat on his rock being fussed over by Dr. Brennan, who declared the colonel's wound superficial but requiring bed rest and observation. The old soldier protested, of course, until Sarah settled the matter with characteristic directness. "You're staying at the ranch until you're healed, Vernon. No arguments. We have room, and I won't have you riding back to Santa Fe just to collapse halfway there." Vernon's protest died in his throat as he recognized the tone that had commanded respect from hardened soldiers during the war. "Yes, ma'am," he said meekly. Then with a slight smile, "Though I warn you, I'm a terrible patient. Ask anyone who served with me." "Then you'll fit right in," Sarah replied. "Whitehorse men have a long tradition of being stubborn about healing. You'll be in good company." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the chaos of battle gave way to the quieter work of aftermath. Bodies were tended, property assessed, statements taken. The Shadow Pine Mesa siege would become legend in Arizona Territory. The story of a widow who held her ground against corruption and greed, who proved that honor and skill could triumph over numbers and money. But for Sarah Whitehorse, standing on her land with her son beside her and friends around her, the victory meant something simpler and more profound. Thomas's legacy was secure. The ranch he'd built would pass to another generation, and the promises made between friends had been kept even beyond death's attempt to void them. Vernon, watching Sarah and Ethan together, thought of his old friend Thomas and permitted himself a rare smile. He'd kept his promise. The widow and her son were safe. The land was secure. And in a world that often seemed to value nothing but profit and power, they'd proven that some things remained sacred family honor and the bonds forged between people who chose to stand together against the darkness. The legend of Shadow Pine Mesa would endure, passed down through generations, as a testament to one woman's precision, one family's courage, and the eternal truth that justice, when wielded by steady hands and unwavering hearts, could never truly be defeated. Spring arrived at Shadow Pine Mesa, 6 months after the siege, transforming the landscape from winter browns to vibrant greens that seemed impossible after the violence that had stained these hills. The snows had melted from the high peaks, feeding streams that ran full and cold through valleys where new grass grew thick enough to hide a man's boots. The ranch that Franklin Walsh had tried to steal through corruption and murder now thrived under clear skies and honest ownership, a testament to what endures when built on solid foundations rather than greed. Ethan Whitehorse rode the eastern boundary fence line, his deputy marshal's badge catching the morning sunlight as he checked markers and surveyed the land his family had defended at such cost. At 19, he'd grown into the lean strength of early manhood, his face still young, but his eyes showing the gravity of someone who'd seen violence and chosen honor despite its price. The pistol at his hip was his father's, carried now with the authority of territorial law behind it. But the lessons that truly kept him alive came from the woman who watched him from the ranch house porch, a cup of coffee steaming in her hands. Sarah Whitehorse had changed little in the months since the siege, at least in appearance. Her hair showed a few more silver strands, perhaps, and the lines around her eyes had deepened with experiences that aged the soul more than the body. But her bearing remained that of someone absolutely certain of her place in the world, rooted to this land by ties deeper than any legal document could express. She watched her son with the complex mixture of pride and concern that all mothers feel when their children grow beyond needing protection, but never beyond deserving it. Behind her, the ranch house itself bore subtle improvements. New shutters, reinforced doors, a stone chimney rebuilt where winter weather had found weaknesses. But the most significant addition was the small cabin that now stood 50 yards from the main house, smoke rising from its chimney in lazy curls that spoke of comfortable habitation. Colonel Vernon Blackwood emerged from that cabin, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had absorbed considerable damage, but whose spirit remained unbroken. The wound he'd taken during the siege had healed well under Dr. Brennan's care and Sarah's insistence on proper rest. But Vernon was 65 years old, though the siege and his wound had aged him in ways that transcended mere calendar years, and even the strongest constitutions bow eventually to time's relentless pressure. He'd accepted Sarah's offer to remain on the ranch permanently, finding in this quiet corner of Arizona territory a peace he'd never known during decades of military service. "Your boy's getting good," Vernon observed, climbing the porch steps with his morning coffee. "Rides the boundary like he was born to it," which I suppose he was. "He has his father's dedication," Sarah replied, "but he's learned to temper it with patience. That's what will keep him alive when the job gets dangerous." "It will get dangerous," Vernon said, with the certainty of experience. "Martial work always does. But Everett's training him well, and between what Thomas taught him about being a lawman and what you've taught him about precision, the boy's as prepared as anyone can be." They stood in companionable silence, watching Ethan complete his circuit and turn his horse back toward the ranch. The easy comfort between Sarah and Vernon spoke to months of shared meals, quiet conversations, and the kind of friendship that needs no performance or pretense. Vernon had become something between an uncle and a grandfather to Ethan, while serving as Sarah's confidant and the keeper of Thomas's memory in ways that honored the fallen marshal without diminishing his widow's strength. "Letter came yesterday," Sarah said, producing an envelope from her pocket. "From Silas Crane. He wanted us to know the trial concluded." Vernon took the letter, reading with the careful attention he gave to all important documents. Crane's handwriting was steady despite the permanent damage Walsh's bullet had done to his internal organs. The railroad man had survived, though he would carry the scars of that day for whatever years remained to him. The letter detailed how Crane had used the evidence Thomas Whitehorse compiled to prosecute the men responsible for the bridge collapse that killed his son. 3 corporate executives, 2 inspectors, and a territorial engineer had been convicted of criminal negligence and fraud. The trials had been sensations in the eastern newspapers, exposing the corruption that valued profit over human life. Young Thomas Crane's death had finally received the justice his father had sought for so many anguished years. "He's donating the money," Vernon said, reading the letter's conclusion. "The entire settlement from the railroad company, building a school in his son's name with engineering standards that Thomas Whitehorse himself would have approved." "Good," Sarah said simply. "Thomas would have liked that. justice and legacy combined into something that helps others. Crane also says he's leaving the railroad business entirely. Moving to California, plans to teach surveying and proper construction techniques at a university, trying to ensure future engineers don't make the mistakes that killed his boy. Vernon folded the letter carefully, handing it back to Sarah. A man broken by grief, redeemed by truth. Not the ending anyone expected when this started. The best endings rarely are, Sarah replied. We expect justice to look like revenge victory, to look like destruction. But sometimes the truest victories are the ones where enemies become allies, and broken men find purpose beyond their pain. Ethan reached the house swinging down from his saddle with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. He carried himself differently now, with a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from proven competence. The boy who'd needed his mother's protection had transformed into a man capable of providing it. "Eastern boundary is secure," he reported, removing his hat as he climbed the porch steps. "Found some tracks near the creek, but they're 3 days old and heading away from our property. Probably just drifters passing through." "Good eye," Vernon said approvingly. "Most young deputies would have missed the aging on those tracks." "Ma taught me to read sign before I could read books," Ethan replied with a slight smile. "Said understanding what you're looking at is more important than just seeing it." Sarah set down her coffee cup, her expression growing serious in a way that made both men pay attention. "Speaking of which, there's something I need to teach you both. A final lesson about what we did here, about what precision really means." She led them to the shooting range Thomas had built years ago, where targets stood at various distances from 50 yards to 500. The Winchester that had become legendary during the siege rested in Sarah's hands, its wood warm from the morning sun, its mechanism maintained with the care of someone who understood that tools determine outcomes. "Ethan, you've learned to shoot well." Sarah began, her voice taking on the cadence of instruction. "Vernon, you've commanded men in battle for most of your adult life, but I want to make sure you both understand something Thomas spent years teaching me, something that kept us alive when others died." She worked the lever action, chambering around with a metallic precision that seemed to echo across the valley. "Anyone can learn to fire a gun. With practice, most people can hit what they aim at least at close range. But that's not what makes the difference between survival and death, between justice and murder." Sarah raised the rifle sighting on a target 300 yards distant. The target bore a playing card, the ace of spades tacked to weathered wood. At this distance, most shooters would struggle to hit the board, let alone the card. "The real skill isn't in pulling the trigger," Sarah continued, her voice steady as stone. "It's in knowing when to pull it and where to aim. Those are two completely different questions, and getting either one wrong can haunt you for the rest of your life." She fired. 300 yards away, the ace of spades acquired a hole dead center, the bullet passing through the card's single pip with surgical accuracy. "During the siege, I fired 20 shots, Sarah said, lowering the rifle. "I could have fired 20 kill shots. Kane, Torres, Morrison, Walsh's hired men, any of them could have died if I'd chosen to aim 6 inches different. But I didn't choose that. Because killing is permanent, and once done, it can never be taken back or corrected." Ethan listened with the intensity of someone recognizing a crucial lesson, while Vernon nodded slowly, understanding where this was heading. "Your father," Sarah said, looking at Ethan, "spent his career as a marshal learning the same thing. He arrested hundreds of men, shot a few, when he had no choice, but killed only when every other option had been exhausted. He used to say that any fool could end a life, but it took wisdom to preserve one while still protecting the innocent." She handed the rifle to Ethan, guiding his hands to the proper position. "When you wear that badge, you carry the power to end lives. The law gives you that authority, but the law can't give you wisdom. That only comes from understanding that precision isn't just about where your bullet lands. It's about understanding the consequences that spread from that impact like ripples in water." "How do you know when it's right to shoot?" Ethan asked the question, carrying the weight of someone who would face that decision himself someday. Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words with the same care she chose targets. You'll know because you'll have exhausted every other option, because the threat is immediate and deadly, and because not shooting will cost innocent lives. But even then, you aim for the minimum necessary force. Disable, don't destroy. Stop the threat without becoming a threat yourself. She pointed to different targets at varying distances. Every one of these represents a choice. Close range you can wound instead of kill. Medium range you can disarm instead of disable. Long range you can warn instead of wound. The farther you are from your target, the more options you have, because distance gives you time to think. Vernon cleared his throat, his voice carrying the gravel of emotion. Your mother isn't just teaching you to shoot, Ethan. She's teaching you to be the kind of man your father was. The kind who uses force as a last resort, not a first response. That's what separates peace officers from gunfighters, marshals from murderers. It's also, Sarah added quietly, what separates men from boys. A boy with a gun thinks the weapon makes him powerful. A man understands that real power is choosing not to use the weapon even when you can. Your father understood that. It's why people respected him even when he arrested them. She took the rifle back, working the action to clear the chamber. During the siege, I sent a message with every shot. Not, I can kill you, but I can control exactly what happens to you. That's far more frightening to a rational person than simple violence, because it demonstrates that you're in complete control of the situation. Walsh wasn't rational, Ethan observed. No, Sarah agreed. Which is why he's dead now, shot by federal marshals when he tried to escape custody 2 months ago. He chose violence over surrender, chose pride over survival. That's what happens when you forget that precision applies to decisions, not just aim. The lesson settled over them like morning dew, subtle but pervasive. This wasn't just about marksmanship. It was about philosophy, about the ethical framework that separated justified violence from murder, about the wisdom to know the difference in the heat of conflict. I want you to remember something, Sarah said, looking between Ethan and Vernon. What we did here defending this land, it wasn't about being the fastest guns or the most brutal fighters. It was about being precise. Precise in our tactics, precise in our shots, precise in our moral judgments. We won because we were more careful than our enemies, not because we were more cruel. Precision over force, Vernon murmured, as if recognizing an old military maxim in new form. Always, Sarah confirmed, because force without precision is just violence. But precision without force is powerless. You need both balanced, perfectly aimed, with absolute certainty at the right target for the right reasons. They walked back toward the house together, the morning growing warmer as the sun climbed higher. Behind them, the targets stood with their precise wounds, testimony to a skill that transcended mere marksmanship and approached something like art. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of crimson and gold, 3 figures sat on the ranch house porch watching daylight die in glory. Sarah occupied the rocking chair Thomas had built her as a wedding present, worn smooth by years of use. Vernon sat on the porch rail, his back against the support post in a position that suggested his injury still bothered him more than he admitted. Ethan sprawled on the steps, young enough to find comfort in positions that would cripple older joints. I've been thinking, Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence, about what happens to this place when I'm working as deputy. Ma can't run it alone. I'm not exactly helpless, Sarah replied with dry amusement. I managed before you were born, and I expect I'll manage after you've moved on to your own life. Not alone, though, Vernon interjected. I'm not much use for heavy labor anymore, but I can handle bookkeeping, manage supplies, supervise hired help when needed. Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on the place while you're out being a hero boy. In the easy way Vernon claimed his place in their family spoke to months of integration that had transformed Guest into permanent fixture. He'd found here what military life had never provided: a home, a purpose beyond orders and conflict, a family bound not by blood but by shared trials and mutual respect. Thomas would have liked this, Sarah said softly, her gaze distant with memory. The three of us working together to maintain what he built. He always said land wasn't really owned, just stewarded for the next generation. I think he'd approve of how we're doing that stewardship. He'd be proud of what you've accomplished, Vernon said, his voice gentle. Both of you. Sarah, you've proven that a woman alone isn't helpless or weak. That skill and determination count for more than physical strength. Ethan, you've grown from a boy into a man your father would recognize as worthy of his name. I wish he could have seen it, Ethan said, the old grief never quite gone, just worn smooth by time. He sees, Sarah said with quiet conviction, maybe not with eyes, but through the legacy he left. This ranch built by his hands and his father's before him. The badge you wear earned through values he taught by example. The skills I passed to you, learned during years when we fought side by side against threats most people never knew existed. She stood moving to the porch rail where she could look out over land that rolled toward distant mountains, purple in the fading light. Legacy isn't about possessions or property, though those matter. It's about the values we pass down, the choices we make, the example we set for others to follow. Your father's legacy isn't this ranch. It's the three of us standing here, continuing to live by the principles he died defending. Vernon raised the glass of whiskey he'd been nursing, the amber liquid catching the last sunlight. To Thomas Whitehorse, a man who understood that real strength isn't about dominating others, but about protecting them. Who knew that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but doing what's right despite being terrified. And who proved that honor isn't weakness, but the hardest strength to maintain. To Pa, Ethan said, raising his own glass of water with solemn formality. To Thomas, Sarah echoed her voice thick with emotion that time had softened but never eliminated. They drank in silence, three souls bound together by love for a man who died too young but had lived fully enough to leave marks on the world that would long outlast his flesh. As full darkness settled over Shadowpine Mesa, lights began appearing in the ranch house windows, warm yellow glows that spoke of safety and permanence. Inside those walls, three people would share a simple meal, trade stories, both new and familiar, and reinforce the bonds that had transformed strangers into family. But before they went inside, Sarah paused at the door, looking back at the darkening landscape one last time. Somewhere out there in the vastness of Arizona territory, other families fought their own battles against corruption, greed, and violence. Other widows struggled to maintain property against men who saw weakness in their gender rather than strength in their character. Other young men wore badges and tried to navigate the treacherous ground between justice and revenge. We should tell the story, Sarah said suddenly. What happened here, how we survived, what we learned, not for glory or fame, but so others know it's possible to fight power with precision, to defend what's right without becoming wrong in the process. Tell it how? Vernon asked. I don't know yet. Maybe Ethan writes it down as he travels with Everett, shares it with other lawmen who face similar situations. Maybe I teach other women the skills Thomas and I learned so they're not helpless when trouble comes. Maybe you document the tactics, the strategies, the ways a small force can defeat a larger one through superior planning and precise execution. Vernon nodded slowly. A manual of sorts. Not just for combat, but for ethical conflict. How to fight without losing your soul in the process. Exactly, Sarah said. Thomas died protecting others. The least we can do is ensure his lessons survive to protect those who come after. As they moved inside the door, closing on the night, the legend of Shadowpine Mesa continued to grow in the surrounding territory. Stories spread through saloons and general stores told by travelers who'd heard it from someone who knew someone who'd been there. The tale grew in the telling, as such stories do, acquiring embellishments and exaggerations that transformed history into myth. They said a widow held off an army with a rifle that never missed. They said an old soldier turned a mountain into a fortress with nothing but knowledge and planning. They said a young man proved courage wasn't about strength or speed, but about standing firm when easier paths beckoned. Some of the stories were true, some were wishful thinking, but the core remained accurate on Shadow Pine Mesa in Arizona Territory. In the year 1885, ordinary people had done extraordinary things not through superior force, but through precision planning and an unwavering commitment to principles worth defending. Years later, when Ethan Whitehorse became a legend in his own right, when Sarah's name was spoken with the same reverence reserved for frontier heroes, when Vernon's tactical innovations were studied in military academies, people would ask what made them different, what separated them from the countless others who'd fought and failed, who'd defended and died, who'd tried to stand against corruption and been swept away. The answer was always the same, spoken in Sarah's voice from that day on the shooting range. Anyone can pull a trigger. The skill is knowing when to pull it and where to aim. Precision over force, wisdom over violence, legacy over momentary victory. These were the lessons of Shadow Pine Mesa, and they endured long after the people who lived them had returned to the earth they'd defended. In the ranch house that night, Sarah, Vernon, and Ethan sat around the table Thomas had built, sharing a meal in the lamplight, their voices mixing with laughter and companionship. Outside, the stars emerged in their millions eternal witnesses to human struggles that played out beneath their indifferent light. The land would endure. The values would persist. And the story of what happened here, polished by time and telling, would inspire others facing their own battles against seemingly impossible odds. This was legacy. This was honor. This was the promise kept between friends who refused to let death sever the bonds of loyalty and love. And on Shadow Pine Mesa, where the wind sang through ancient pines and water ran cold from mountain springs, the land itself seemed to remember. To honor those who defended it with such fierce precision, to preserve their memory in stone and soil, and the endless cycle of seasons that marked time's passage without diminishing the importance of what had happened here. Some legends are built on exaggeration, others on truth too remarkable to require embellishment. The story of Sarah Whitehorse, the woman whose every bullet landed exactly where she aimed, belonged to the latter category. And in a world hungry for heroes who fought with honor rather than just fought, her legend would endure as long as people remembered that precision matters, that choices have consequences, and that sometimes the deadliest weapon is the one wielded by someone who knows exactly when not to fire it. The lamp burned late that night in the Whitehorse Ranch house, three voices blending in conversation that honored the past while building toward the future. And if Thomas Whitehorse was watching from wherever the dead go to rest, he must have smiled to see his legacy so carefully preserved by people who understood that what he'd built was worth more than gold, more valuable than any property deed, more enduring than any monument carved in stone. He'd built a family bound by honor, and that more than anything else was a legacy that would never die.